The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Glenn Stevens from Mish Auto, and I want to thank everybody for taking some time this afternoon to tune in. So welcome to our virtual MPC conversations. We would have liked to have been on the island, Mackinac Island, for Mish Auto on the island back in May, and certainly in August when we rescheduled it, but obviously we're living in times which we didn't anticipate. And to that end, we put together a special program for you today, but before we do that, I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors and our partners on this day. First of all, I want to thank KPMG. They have been with us for several years now. They have worked very closely with us, specifically Michael Pricer, and he has been a great asset to our team and also to other people at the chamber. So we really have appreciated, Michael, your help. And one of the things that we've also been doing is making sure that we are working on content that's relevant to you and that is immediate and impactful for your businesses right now. And so that's what we've done today. I also want to thank our supporting partners who've been with us and have stuck through this trying time with us. So thanks for being with us today. A couple of housekeeping things. First of all, you can use the chat function. You'll see that on the right side of your screen to ask a question and to get part of the conversation when we get to that. So with that, I want to introduce Sam Fogelman, who is a partner with KPMG. And Sam, I'm going to turn the program over to you, and I'll wrap things up in a little bit. So thank you very much for being with us today, everyone.
Great, Glenn, thank you. See if we can get to the start of the presentation here. All right, so I'd like to first of all introduce Atif Zaim and Mike DeClaudio. Atif and Mike are two of my fellow partners, and importantly, they along with myself are also part of our leadership team around our Restarting America effort, which is very much focused on not only coming back safely, but staying safe as we return and looking at how we can change our business models and what kinds of things we can do as organizations to take advantage of this time to improve our operations, how we work with our employees, and how we deliver our goods and services. So very glad to have them on board. They'll be talking with us here in a bit. Atif, if you could go to slide 3 for me. Great, thank you. So clearly this pandemic is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to transform how you work, your workforce, and your delivery model. But based on the survey results that we see from a recent Mish Auto survey, it also shows the threat of the pandemic to both talent acquisition and retention. Only Tesla ranked in the top 10 for business, engineering, or computer science. And frankly, our suppliers didn't fare better than the OEMs. The highest engineering rank was 33rd, computer science was a 94th, and we didn't crack the top 100 in business. Our recent surveys of American workers have some interesting statistics that you'll hear more about as we go through the session. 73% of employees say their commitment to their organization has increased through the pandemic, and 71% say their desire to stay has increased. That's good. But 77% say demands have increased, and nearly 50% report their mental health has declined. And 35% say their team's ability to collaborate has deteriorated. We also have 64% of workers who want flexibility to work remotely, at least part of the time. And relatedly, 80% of workers say they would turn down a job offer that doesn't offer flexible work arrangements. So what does this mean? It means that we find ourselves in a conundrum. We're finding that employees are experiencing cognitive overload, but still crave flexibility in their day-to-day, that working alone is easier than working together, but that connected doesn't always equal connection. So to deal with this conundrum, we as KPMG are telling companies to focus on the work, not where you work. So Tief and Mike are going to take you through how to approach this conundrum and how to take advantage of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Tief will start with what we've learned from our client conversations, and Mike then will take you through how KPMG is working with our clients to solve the conundrum. And so with that, Tief, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Sam. Yeah, so as Sam said, I'm going to just take you through what we've learned from about I think it's over 100 one-on-one client conversations, and certainly many more in terms of webcasts and the commentary that you get through surveys and what have you. And then Mike will come through and drill into a little bit of the detail around that. So if I go from first on the timing of return, so we've split this out into 3 categories. You could probably do it in different categories. The 3 categories that we have are critical workers, and these are essentially folks that never really left. So these are first responders and hospital workers and people manning the power plants and that sort of stuff. They never really left, so we don't talk about the timing of return for them. Workers needing physical infrastructure. So, this is an interesting, we deliberately chose these words. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be in touch with other people, but really what you need is close to the physical infrastructure. And unfortunately, as a result of that, you tend to come in contact with other people as well. So manufacturing and retail, typically we see that coming back as soon as the state guidance allows. And then some higher education, if you look at that, most of them are going online, but there are some that we're certainly working with that are figuring out a physical solution, trying to put some protocols in place that would allow, maybe if not immediately in the fall, but then certainly in the spring, particularly around college sports and what have you. Office workers is where it gets really interesting, and that's frankly one of the areas where we've spent the most amount of our time. Even where the states have allowed it, most of the employers or many of the employers that we've talked to are pushing the timeline to later in the year. Some of them have gone as far as the middle of next year. So certainly when you think about the West Coast technology firms, many of them have come out and said July of next year, August of next year. They're thinking in that as to allow their employees to plan better if they're renewing leases or doing other things that require decisions to be made, for 6 months or so, to allow them to do that. The other interesting thing that we're finding is that even where offices have been open, so we're working with a number of clients here in New York where they've said, the office is open, we're going to open at 25% capacity. The uptake of office workers remains very, very low. So single-digit percentages. And it's a number of factors driving that. In and around the tri-state area in Manhattan, it's not so much about, how would I feel when I'm in the office and how safe would I feel when I'm in the office, but rather how do I actually get there, right? Public transportation is a big part of that. In other locations, it's around, well, I've got kids at home and I don't have childcare options available, and therefore I can't leave them at home and go to work. So it's kind of interesting where even where it has opened, the uptake has been lower than you might have thought. In terms of what are the policies and processes our clients are employing, it's the typical ones that you would hear about and probably quite similar to the ones that you have in place for yourselves. It's just symptom checks and temperature checks. It's distancing and PPE requirements and extra cleaning, etc. And mostly manual contact tracing, although we've seen some sporadic interest in it, but largely it's been when I say sporadic interest, I mean interest in having it done automatically, so using location-based contact tracing, but mostly it is manual. Testing still hasn't taken off to the extent we thought we would have taken off. We're working with a couple of organizations on setting up their testing programs. We obviously at KPMG don't provide testing, so we're working with providers of testing, so labs, and what we're helping is setting up the logistics around it such that testing could be executed. But those are in unique cases. Really, think of sports leagues. That sort of an environment is where we're seeing that come through. The workers needing physical infrastructure, similar protocols, and as I said before, in higher ed, we're working with a couple of them where they're quite keen on allowing more physical interaction than they've perhaps opened with, using some technology solutions to enable that. In the office workforce, when we started having these conversations in March, there was a high level of interest in having concepts like WorkPass and looking at the community threat level, etc. And we have done work with a number of our clients for office workers. So basically, you have a check-in app, you have the community threat incorporated in your decision making in terms of, am I going to open this office? Am I not going to open this office? Am I going to allow this employee to travel to this location, or I'm not, etc. But by and large, because of the deferral of needing employees to travel for business or to come into the workplace, it is typically it's been reasonably muted to set up some of those technologies and those processes. As I said, the contact tracing, the interest comes up from time to time, and this is the automated contact tracing bit. Everyone has to do contact tracing. The question is, do you do it in an automated manner or not? And one of the things that we're hearing quite a bit is a fair amount of struggles around employee adoption. So the permission the employees want to give to the employer to track them, their location, even while in the office, and even with the typical assurances that this is not something that your immediate supervisor would know. This is something that just stays in the background, only to be activated if somebody reports positive for COVID. So some interesting things that we're seeing there. The bulk of this conversation that we're going to talk about is going to be about the employee themselves, and we're starting to see some interest from a number of companies we're talking about around how do you decide, even beyond COVID, who could predominantly work remote. And it's not who the individual per se, but it's more about the type of job that they're doing for you. And so decide, somebody needs to be here at least once a week, a month, a quarter, etc., versus somebody who could be entirely remote. And then those who could be entirely or predominantly remote, how do you manage them? How do you get the cultural engagement going? So a lot of interest coming up in those areas, and Mike is going to talk a little bit more about that. On the citizens front, there's a fair amount of interest, and actually more than interest. They have set up manual contact tracing operations. We're helping a couple of the governments around that. The interesting challenge that we're having there, or the states are having there, is just the lack of response. I think the number that we hear quite a bit is around 40% or less in terms of people who are responding to who they were with, such that you could establish contact and let people know that they were infected. We don't think this is going away. We think this is going to continually get better, because we think it's a pretty critical part of how to tamp down on outbreaks that may yet occur in the future before the vaccine comes fully into play. So what we just told you is everything that we're hearing from employers. This slide is about what we're hearing from the employees. And Sam previewed some of this. It's interesting. In the early days, it was a little bit of a mixed bag, and maybe it was a mixed bag because all the information wasn't quite there. But there's a lot more favorable opinion around the way the organizations are responding to this, current environment of so many people working remotely. The flexibility. It's a little bit of the genie's come out of the bottle conversation. So over on the right side, you'll see that, in our survey, almost half the workers want some flexibility. Only 17% want to be fully remote, and then about 36% want to return to the office fully, i.e. 5 days, 5 days a week. So that's quite an interesting thing, and I think that has implications for what happens after the vaccine has been discovered and has been administered to large enough people that it actually gets you to for it to be safe. I think employees and workers do want that flexibility. The satisfaction with working remotely, while nobody would say that anyone is having a particularly great time of it, the work-life balance thing, we're in our survey, it seems, has improved quite a bit. Conversely, the people who are going into the office aren't reporting that work-life balance, so the satisfaction has gone up for the people working remotely or people who have flexibility versus the ones that have to go to the office every day, perhaps in a week. And then there's impacts on the culture. I think our survey says that the in-office workers feel that the culture has worsened compared to the remote workers. I think that may be a relative finding. We do think this is a little bit of a danger zone, and again, Mike's going to talk a little bit more about that later in terms of how do you inculcate the culture of the organization when you're not bumping into the individuals, those serendipitous interactions, and for them to be able to see you physically do certain things through which people learn what the culture of an organization is. So while there's a little bit of a difference between what the in-office workers are saying versus the remote workers, we think that continues to be a hotspot that needs careful attention. And then last but not least, this is something that, it's so obvious that it shouldn't need to be said, but sometimes, in our myriad of objectives that we're all trying to meet, we sometimes lose sight of it, is employee value is key. So the workers who feel organizations actually care about their well-being and value them report better productivity, commitment to the organization, and in their own self-reported quality of the work. So an interesting perspective from the employees directly versus the employers. And I wanted to just catch you up on something, some of the conversations we've been having across the country. But with that, Mike, let me pass this over to you to take it to the next section of the presentation.
Actually, Atif, if we can pause for a second.
Yes.
We do have a question in from Mary Buchsteiger with Lucerne International. Mary, I apologize if I didn't pronounce your name correctly, but we'll go ahead and turn the mic on and let you ask your question. Can we get Mary's mic turned on, please?
Mary, you have to hit the mute icon on your webinar.
While we're waiting for a second, Mary, let us know when you're ready. Just as a quick reminder, you can either raise your hand to ask a question, or there is a question box that you can submit questions in, and we will bring those up. The questions that are submitted that way we'll bring up at the end in the Q&A session. If you raise your hand in between, we will try to get you recognized as we work through the session itself.
Shall we continue, Glenn?
Yeah, let's go ahead and continue. And if Mary catches us, Mary, just jump in if you can unmute.
Okay. Mike, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Atif. Hi, everyone. Mary, if you're able to unmute, just interrupt me. I've got kids. I'm totally used to it. I wanted to share a little bit of findings of what we've been kind of working on with clients, frankly, both ourselves, like KPMG was client 0, being that we've had people kind of all around the world when this crisis hit, and have needed to find ways to still serve our clients in an increasingly remote capacity. But also organizations across industries, Tiff has been mentioning some in the Northeast. We've been actually doing some work here in Detroit. I live in Detroit. So there's been some cool findings, I guess, so far. And we'll highlight sort of 3 or 4 specific areas that might be of most relevance to you. And of course, answer any questions you all might have. Comments along the way, and then always happy to take questions offline. So let's pick up kind of where Atif left off in terms of kind of shared experiences. So Sam first and Atif mentioned some of the data from our research. Just to give you some of the anecdotal bent around that. There's been this notion of a precarious balance that we're seeing with a lot of clients right now, particularly in Michigan, Southeast Michigan in particular, where if you're in a public school system or even in universities, Atif was mentioning a lot of universities going virtual. If you have kids that are at Central, or friends or family that's at Central, you're kind of experiencing that firsthand right now, where it was come back and then now there's an outbreak and now what do we do? So there's this precarious balance that a lot of our employees are finding, and they're frankly a bit struggling with the combination of just trying to find some stability throughout the day, knowing what a virtual schooling mechanism looks like. I have 2 kids and trying to figure out virtual schooling for them, while at the same time, my wife is trying to figure out what her schedule is going to be. I'm trying to figure out my schedule, and all of that is sort of prone to the winds of change. Both as kind of we get back into school systems, but also as there's any potential shutdowns or increased changes in our status. So there is a level of balance that employees are trying to maintain, but it comes at the cost of a lot of kind of physical mental health. So we'll talk a little bit about just thinking about different cohorts in your organization and what you can do on the mental health side. Sam mentioned the phrase kind of working virtually and working together, not always the same thing. What we found both from April when we first surveyed employees through just this month when we most recently surveyed employees was that people were sort of getting the hang of working in a virtual environment. There was a lot of forced things up front. So we were doing like kind of forced happy hours, and we were doing kind of online conferences or online concerts. I had a client who was doing concerts for her employees where she would kind of set it up and there would be 10,000 people log into a Zoom to watch a concert. So there was a lot of some of those what might feel like extraordinary efforts that we were putting in April and May, and that felt that way. They're becoming a little bit more organic now. It seems to be the pulse of the American worker that they're starting to understand how to work in a more hybridized environment. Some people in an office, some people not in an office doing it via webcam or the like, and that's becoming increasingly normalized for them, which is leading to 2 big requirements for us. The first is this notion of maintaining flexibility. Atif talked about, let's call it mass opportunities for vaccination. That's certainly going to be the last finish line for this. There's going to be a series of initial finish lines for this, where if it's just getting into a part of having community threat levels being incredibly low. Certainly here in Michigan, there are parts here's rough, but up here not so much. Like you're used to that sort of variability. We are working with a lot of organizations who some of them are saying after Labor Day, most of them are saying 2021. So just figuring out that flexibility, and once you do reopen your workplace, is that about returning to a December 2019 model? The general consensus there is it's not, that the workplace is going to become more of a flexible environment. Come when you need to come when the task requires you to be there. We'll talk about this notion of task-based working in a second, and outcome-based working, and you allowing kind of that work environment to be working where you are, working from home when it's the appropriate time, working from in an office setting if that's what you need, in a customer when that's what you need to diagnose a part or something like that. And all of that requires a massive shift in management style. I think this is actually going to be the big finding from this when we reflect on this in 2 or 3 years and think, wow, gosh, remember 2020 and how wild 2020 was? And kind of thinking about the massive changes that have happened, the real tell will be if it's shifted management styles. If we can define new measures of productivity, if we have analytics that are really guiding us to think about everything from compliance on one end through to behavior and behavioral change on the other, in really thinking about management from the executive level through your middle management layers and some of your supervisory structures in a different way. Being more about enabling people and meeting employees where they're at. So that will be a really interesting finding again in the 2022, 2023 timeline. Like, let's have that conversation then. But it gives you a sense as to what you should be focusing on here in the near term as you're seeking to make some of these changes a little bit more permanent. So I mentioned kind of task. We've again, because we're consultants and we are big fans of alliteration, we wanted to share with you what we're seeing as kind of a better way, maybe perhaps a cleaner way to dissect work, perhaps than what we're used to. So obviously we've had work breakdown structures for 40 years since the PMI kind of first rolled those things out. We've a lot of fans on the phone of everything from Lean to Six Sigma to different different business systems and business models that help you really take an outcome and break it into a set of discernible tasks that you can manage and measure. That all worked when you had a stability in the environment. A stability in everything from your supply chain and from the place where your employees were working. You'd have to introduce kind of new ways to deal with a little bit of volatility there. So what we're looking at, particularly as we're thinking about what's the right way to be thinking about work location, is you have to kind of ask yourself 5 big questions, like what's the task? What is the thing that person is trying to do or trying to achieve? What kind of type of work is it? Is this single, pounding out a financial statement work? Is this a collaborative, engineering? We've done a lot of our testing, and now it comes together to do a bit of kind of joint brainstorm on how to evolve a product. Let's think about the type of work. Let's think about the tools that are required. Obviously, in this forum, we're all very familiar with the fact that work from home is great, but you can't build parts. You can't bring a 2 million pound manufacturing line home to just run through the living room. So, thinking about the tools required to do the job is really important, and that can take it into some interesting places. We can start having conversations about more virtual learning. We can have conversations about different ways to kind of diagnose customer needs and whether or not we need to be kind of present for that, or if there are new and interesting tools for that. We've seen a big uptick in kind of augmented reality learning, as an example. And then the 2 other ones to consider are around time and technology. So thinking about time, is this something that is boxed into the traditional business day? I mentioned the precarious balance, the need for flexibility. I'm injecting the school thing just because I have massive amounts of anxiety about that at the moment, but there are all sorts of other demands on people's times. And then the question becomes, are we going to start to normalize around what working hours should and shouldn't be? Are we going to normalize around protecting certain times of the day, regardless of whether or not they fit into the traditional 8 to 5, 8 to 6 work window, so that we allow for everything from helping kids get set up in a virtual environment to answering questions, all the way through to caring for if it's elder family members or things of that nature. So understanding real kind of time constraints for work. Some things are required on a day because of a business requirement. Some things are required on a day because we're just sort of used to saying, get me that by tomorrow. And we're trying to normalize around what real time requirements need to be. The last is around technology. This thought of like, what's an enabling tech for you? I think a lot of us have become, if not fully proficient in virtual environments like this, at least partly proficient. If you're on Zoom, if you're on GoToWebinar, you're on Teams, Skype, FaceTime, like whatever it is, there's a big normalization effort happening in the tech realm, certainly in the white collar workforce. And then, seeing that trickle, I mentioned augmented reality learning. We've been seeing that take a kind of short hold a little bit in the last few months as organizations figure out ways to train, really disparate workforces without bringing them into what would ultimately be a potential super spreader event if I put everyone in a big classroom. So finding new ways to use technology to help kind of solve that out. So wanted to give you this. I think there's like a little screen grab button for you. And certainly if you're taking notes or if you want to follow up, we can send this along. But just a different way to start thinking about the work that might help you break perhaps some paradigms you might have about whether or not it needs to be in an office or whether or not it could be someplace else. So that was sort of one aspect we wanted to talk about. I'm going to squint down at my other monitor here to see if there's any questions. None so far. All right. Second was around new ways of analyzing the workforce. So this has been obviously something that I know in this forum we've spoken about a couple of times, new ways to think about how to manage workers, new ways to think about how to kind of better analyze what's going on in your workforce. I think we've all become fairly adept in the workplace analytics of what you might call kind of past tense analytics. So I know how many people left last month, and maybe I know why they left, and maybe I have some sort of demographic breakdown that tells me, it sure does seem that people who are left-handed seem to be leaving at a pace faster than people are right-handed, and you can do some of those kind of past tense analytics. What we've seen in the last couple of months, and this is true across a multitude of organizations, including some that, frankly, I was surprised because they had been sort of historically somewhat wary of being of using analytics outside of a kind of reporting on past activities sense. But they've become, including one of the OEs here in town, have become very intrigued by understanding a more predictive nature and really using analytics to truly understand what people are doing and to truly understand how people are working, not for the purposes of trying to reconform them to a aforementioned standard, but so they can evolve their own management practices, their own policies, their own way of thinking about work to better match the flow of how employees get the job done. And again, this brings about all sorts of interesting questions. How do I know if people are really working is the biggest dilemma that a lot of folks in management have had in the last 5 months. I don't think my people are as productive. I don't feel like we're being as collaborative. And a lot of those become anecdotal conversations. A lot of those become instinctive reactions, but really challenged to find what's actually happening in terms of real measures of productivity. In the finance function, are you still closing the quarter? Are you doing it accurately? Obviously, every aspect of the supply chain, we understand the productivity measures there becomes a little bit more challenging. And a lot of times we conflate productivity with participation. And we're thinking about how many hours are people working? Are they available after 6? Can I get to them when I need to get to them? And that type of work environment, again, when you compound that with an environment that's now foreign because people are working from dining rooms and basements, they're doing it in an environment with increased mental health stress. You can find a lot of articles around sort of the advent and the reemergence of EAP, employee assistance providers. Perhaps you're even doing that for your own employees. The question becomes, how can I better predict what's going to happen in my workforce and use more predictive analytics to understand everything from, and if you go to the next slide, we kind of break these out into a little bit more detail, everything from burnout to potential attrition on the sort of, let's call it negative side of that, to some of the more positive things. Who are my people who are really shining? Who are people who are really seem to embrace this way of working and they're able to still be incredibly effective and they're networking with other folks and becoming a real force multiplier in my business, and they're viewed as sort of the leaders in their team even if they're not in a management position. And there's ways that we can use more predictive analytics to understand some of these questions. I think the challenge point we give executive teams is we want you to know as much about your employees as perhaps you know about your customers. So that means digging into all sorts of additional data sets and data sources to really get a sense for what is there and what you're able to kind of sense out with your employee base. So that's a view on analytics. And again, because of who we are in our nature, as sort of looking after risk in the market and trying to help organizations really understand compliance and risk attributes, in addition to all the other wonderful things that we do. We're also talking about compliance. So there's a few different elements here. If you follow the Department of Labor, who doesn't? They just issued findings this past week on how to treat non-exempt employees who are working in a virtual environment. So if you have any hourly employees, think administrative staff or other folks who are in the non-exempt category, there's some potential compliance issues there. If they're not tracking all of the hours that they're working, they're sending emails out at night or attending a quick conference call here, or taking a phone call there. And if we're not equipping them with mechanisms to capture that time, both they're exposed and the employer is potentially exposed. So that's just from an employee perspective. Obviously, there's a lot of tax implications. Those of us, my office used to be right downtown Detroit. Now my office is in suburban Detroit. I'm no longer exposed to Detroit city tax, and that's true for a lot of us on the phone. And if you've got folks in other taxing municipalities, you've got anyone who's living in Windsor and used to commute across the bridge, and you have a whole different set of tax challenges there. So just thinking about where your employees are and what their potential kind of tax challenges might be from both a corporate perspective and mobility perspective. We've yet to see what extensions are going to happen for things like OSHA in white collar environments. Like, is everyone going to have goofy looking mice to keep from having repetitive wrist injuries and carpal tunnel? And is that something that's going to be a requirement for you as an employer? The short answer is we don't know yet. That's probably one where case law is going to go faster than tort reform. So, obviously keeping a lookout on that, but that's another opportunity. This title of this thing is about engendering trust. That's another opportunity for us to really get focused on how can I create kind of avenues to my employees where maybe I'm ahead of the curve and maybe I'm doing it for a compliance reason, but really I'm doing this to increase the value to my employees. And we're seeing a lot of things like extending folks. If you got a cool monitor at office, go in, you bring it home. If you've got your keyboard, bring it home, that sort of stuff, to give people kind of the feeling of continued value that used to just be in the office, and now it's extended to the home environment. Sam, is there anything, I know, Sam, you do this for a living, anything in terms of thinking about best approaches for compliance for folks? I think, Tiff, on the second to last slide here, we've got just a construct on just things to think about, everything from strategy through program management, and any other kind of words of wisdom we want to make sure this group hears.
Yeah, I think one of the key things from a compliance perspective is that organizations do need to stand back from their existing governance processes. I think the analogy I've used on any number of conversations has been, look, the fact is we're building the car as it's running down the road, and in fact the road is changing in front of us. So doubly complex situation that we find ourselves in. And so as we're building these individual components of our playbooks, as we think about, what are we going to do with our workforce and how we deliver goods and services, I think we do need to logically stand back from the governance structures that we put in place to support the things that we've done historically to say, do they still apply, or are there new areas that we need to think about? I mean, you can start to think about things like privileged health information. We haven't really, organizations have tried very hard not to deal with that. The question is they may need to deal with some of it. So now what's that framework look around, right? Or other privacy issues that might come to bear? Or as we start to change how we think about things, let's take workforce analytics, right? As we're building those in, how are we building the governance framework to make sure we're avoiding biases in those analytics, and that we're testing and challenging those to make sure that we're doing the right things at the end of the day to get the information we need. So there's a number of areas that are going to come up in this space, but I think a thoughtful stand back from the governance framework that you have to say, what do we need to change, is going to be a very important part of what we're doing as we move forward.
That's right, and to the point about building the car, I think in our last slide here, and then we'll stop and answer any questions y'all might have. That notion of building the car while also driving down the road, I mean, even building the road while we're driving on it, it's going to be important for us to be thinking about this new stabilization and a restart model while at the same time figuring out what it is whether or not this has been a catalyst for us to perhaps accelerate what would have otherwise been a 3 or 5 year workforce transformation, or if this is a model where we're going to do our best to return ourselves to a December 2019 model. I think the vast majority of organizations are using this as a catalyzing moment. So we'll give you some words here. I won't bother reading them to you. But the construct here is if you're thinking about kind of reopening office space, is to really, don't use December of 2019 as your example. Try some new things to be thinking about that, and more of a supporting a hybrid work approach seems to be the most common refrain amongst organizations in the market, certainly inclusive of those here in Detroit. So Atif, Sam, I'll turn back to you guys, Glenn, and answer any all questions you might have.
So why don't we have us all come back on video? So Atif, if you could join us. A couple of questions that I'd like to put out here for us. One is as we work across industry sectors and with so many companies, where are we seeing companies that are seizing this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity? And open question, Atif, to both you and Mike. So
I'll give it a go. And I think it's important to realize that it's so early days that what I'm going to tell you is going to be more about where they are thinking of seizing the moment as opposed to they have already gone ahead and seized the moment. So there's in particular there's a couple of companies, but one in particular, it happens to be in pharma, and they've come out and taken a very bold step, and they've basically said, listen, if you need to work remotely, you're okay to work remotely permanently. In fact, they've gone as far as to say they have a concept called activity-based working. So they say if you want to come into the office, you're really only going to come in for activity-based working in the office. And basically, if you, I mean, that's a corporate jargon, but underneath it, what it basically means is if you're doing whiteboarding sessions, if you're collaborating with others, etc., and that has huge implications for, what does the workspace look like? Right? So the office is no longer a sea of cubicles surrounded by a handful of offices. The office now is a space where you can actually do those kinds of things like whiteboarding and all that sort of stuff. So Sam, I would say it's the beginning, but we have seen the beginnings in a couple, 3 of our clients that are actually getting ahead of this.
Okay.
Mike,
another question for you. Sorry?
So I just wanted to see if Mike had anything to add to that.
Sorry, Mike. So, okay. So Steve, another question. So what are you seeing as the most important areas to continue to focus on from an employee perspective? And kind of add to that, what are companies doing as they think about that focus on the employee side? In our conversations, what are we seeing and hearing?
I think, I mean, you can take it in a couple of different ways, and the more tactical, tangible things are the things around, hey, how do you make sure you get people access to childcare, or might you pick up their Wi-Fi tab because now they're on a higher bandwidth or what have you than they used to before for their personal purposes or what have you. I personally would go back to something Mike said earlier, which is employees are the thing that's going to matter the most to them is the management style, and that transition from, I was talking to the CRO of a bank recently, and he was saying, Atif, I manage because my office is on the same floor where the majority of my workforce is, and I come out of my office and I stop by their desk and ask them what they're doing, or I bump into them in the lunchroom or whatever else, right? And he goes, I have no way of, I don't know where to begin to manage people who I can't see. And that transition, if you don't execute it right, don't provide the right training, there's a willingness to change part of it, which is slightly separate. If you, as an organization, if you change that mindset to say this is a new environment, and just because they're not right in front of you doesn't mean that you can't necessarily get culture imparted to them, or measure their performance, etc. I think that's probably the biggest area for me. Like, you might have something else to add.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think the best way to inform that, like if you guys do nothing else, and if you haven't done this already, please forget everything we've said. Survey your employees. Survey them frequently, survey them often, and really to get a real sense of how your employees are feeling, what their challenges are about working from home, how you can help them, how to create empathy. I think this notion of evolving the role of management that Atif's talking about, part of that is going to be around increased empathy. So the ENTJs can stand up right now. And I think there's a huge need for us to have data to support that. We're seeing a lot of anecdotes right now. Anecdotes are very powerful, but the plural of anecdote isn't data. So it's really good to root it and say, look, we surveyed you last month. You said these things. Here are the actions we're taking based on how you responded. And again, building trust with your employees, there's no better way than doing the things that they told you they needed, and really being able to fulfill that promise. And that's a big lesson learned from some of the earlier movers, kind of that May, June timeframe that we're feeling a little bit more stable. They were, every single one of them were surveying their employees on a regular basis.
A question that's come in, another question here is, what are the best practices you're seeing and how to overcome the drawbacks with remote work? Example, feeling of belonging to a team, connection to the customer, etc. Mike, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that. So the drawbacks of, yes, so drawbacks to remote working, including but aren't limited to the feeling of connectivity. I think what we've found, and you mentioned connectivity to a customer. So look, we're in sales. A lot of you are in sales. A lot of what we're finding is finding new ways to connect to people who are very much in the same boat you are. We're working with some sales organizations right now that are really struggling because they can't walk the halls of the customer. They can't be present with the customer all the time. Golf courses are great, but dining out is a challenge, and everything inside of an office is somewhat verboten. So we've been doing kind of, and this might sound trite, but go with me for a second. We've been doing things like learn about everything you can about your customer based on even like what's on their desk and their walls behind you. These are great conversation starters. Atif stuff behind his desk, like I know exactly what all that stuff is from the last 5 months of working with him. I know that Sam is not at home right now because I know what his wall looks like. Like there are ways for us to kind of create a feeling of, for one, like professional intimacy without us being proximate. And that's something where, if we're talking to like behavioral scientists, they're talking about ways of finding ways to really better connect with people throughout this thing. And a lot of it comes down to, hygienic things like learning to make eye contact with the camera and that. And again, understanding, the old sales trick in the book, find something on the desk and talk about it, really understanding the things that are kind of in their environment and getting to know them on a different level. So some of those things that's the difference that doesn't feel forced. That's the stuff that's feeling a little bit more organic, and I think has been the stuff that has been showing to be more proactive and productive. So I don't know, Atif, if there's other stuff that resonates
No,
here.
I think you got it. I think you got it, and I think it does. I know today we're talking about the workforce, but obviously it ties in very neatly to, we've been talking about digital commerce for a number of years. Or digital sales or digital service and what have you. And those things have become so important to make sure you've got them just right. And particularly in a B2B environment where, B2C, it's a matter of survival. In B2B, it's, the expectations are now creeping up where you really need to have that ability where purchasing managers are saying, I don't want to have to talk to you. I just want to be able to do it online myself.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. So probably time for one more question here. Where have we seen good examples of workplace or workforce analytics? Or is it still a relatively nascent area, or a combination of both?
I think by definition, it's an area that's always going to have opportunity to improve. So places where we've seen organizations do it really well, just one shop that's actually a technology company, but they have a pretty diverse workforce. They're all over the place, and they are, they survey their population once a week. So they have, for want of a better phrase, qualitative data from their employees. They also have pretty hardcore demographic data out of multiple systems. They can tie all sorts of employee demography to financial results. So, if you're thinking about where it looks good, it's in organizations that aren't afraid to kind of normalize some data elements between maybe your HR system, your finance system, tie those with some qualitative information. But I think as importantly, like refresh it as frequently as you can. There's an organization here in town that is that is doing that well, and it's a yeoman's effort because they've got some different systems. But once you're able to kind of normalize some of your data, I think then the real question is, are you going to trust what the data says? Or kind of using time as a variable to help you trust what the data says and make changes on it. That becomes a real key aspect of using data effectively.
Great. Okay. I think, Glenn, it's time to turn it back over to you.
It is. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it today. Thanks for your time and your insight. And I want to also thank you for the KPMG partnership. It's been a good one. We look forward to continuing it with you. So I want to thank our partners again, and I also want to thank Rosa, Clark Hill, Denso, GS3, Nextier, SME, Toyota, Warner, and Yazaki for being partners with us too. So to all of you that have tuned in and are on the line, if you have any questions, please follow up with us. But thank you for joining us today, and everyone have a great day. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.